on Racing Ahead in the Saddle with Chris Symons.
And it's great having arguably Australia's most informed jockey, Chris Symons, in the studio with me. Well done yesterday.
Thank you, Shane.
Auditioning for the role as Chris Waller's number one jockey in Melbourne.
Yeah, look, I had a few missed calls last night, 0-2 numbers. I just don't want to be tied down.
just playing your cards safe and close to your chest at the moment, eh?
That's it.
All right, we'll talk more about that international, or the imported galloper, who was quite impressive winning yesterday at Sandown. But we do have a very special guest in the studio today, Racing Victoria's chief steward, Terry Bailey. Terry, good morning.
Morning, Shane. Chris.
It's great having you involved this morning, Terry, because over the last few weeks since Chris has joined the program, we're trying to educate the audience more and more about elements of what happens on the race day. And the relationship between stewards and jockeys is probably one of the more important ones that exists each and every race meeting.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity.
And it's a little bit awkward for me. For starters, my first question is, what should I be calling you today? Mr. Bailey, Mr. B, Terry, or maybe something a little bit more serious in Terrence?
Terry's fine, Chris, but there has been some versions over the years.
Terry, let's talk about the how a race day experience works on behalf of the stewards. How big are your teams that you actually pull together for a race meeting, and is it different between metropolitan and country racing?
We tend to probably have an extra member at metropolitan as opposed to country areas, but we generally operate with 4 to 5 stewards at most TAB covered race meetings anyway. And generally our day starts around about 2.5 hours before the first, and unless there's an issue with the track early morning, that's about the commencement.
All right, so perfect example, there was the situation that happened on Caulfield Cup Day a couple of years ago where we had a lot of rain that sort of hit prior to the meeting. I think it was 2010 from memory, and there was talk as to whether or not the Caulfield Cup meeting would go ahead. When those sort of situations arise, does your day change completely in that sort of situation?
Oh, absolutely. And obviously, there's a lot of pressure from but on a big day like that. But I remember it very clearly that I don't think we'll ever lose another race meeting at Caulfield through wet weather. It was at 6 o'clock in the morning. The rain was horizontal, and yet the track was bordering on a heavy 9, and it was just remarkable, the drainage of the track that they've got at Caulfield these days.
So when your day starts, Terry, what are the first things you need to do once you get to a race meeting?
First thing we do is obviously we go through scratchings, rider changes, and then spend a fair bit of time with our form analyst Andre Casse, who gives us an overview of basically where he believes horses will be placed in the run, any queries that he might have on horses' previous starts, and then we go and look at the track, and if there's any other matters that have been adjourned from previous meetings, they'll be dealt with, and then we hop into the day's proceedings.
So straight off the bat, after a race, what are the first things that you probably look into? Is it interference, maybe a change of a pattern of a horse's racing? What's the order of priority?
Chris, the first thing we'll do is I'll question the stewards that have different vantage points around the track, if they've got any incidents to report, because the first thing we need to do is if there are riders required, obviously we need them to stay on course, and we've tried very hard in recent years to, if riders are finished, to have them on their way, and so that's the first point of call, to make sure any interference is reported straight away. Then Andre Casse will give us his views on anything that may not have fitted into his speed maps, and we'll take it from there.
So when you're looking for, or when you're reviewing a race, Terry, I mean, are you, first and foremost, are you focused on what you see through your own eyes, or are we having a shift now where you're using television monitors to determine what's happening in a race from the outset?
We're shifting to a little bit of both. We've got to rely on people's observations around the track, particularly on big days, because if you have trouble early in the meeting in race 2 or race 3, you've got to rely. You can't just go, well, we'll have a look at race 5 or 6. You've got to work through the race meeting, and if there's trouble in race 6, you've got to rely on those people around the track that if there's interference, it is reported straight away so that we can keep on top of it. So it is a bit of both, but we're finding these days that there's a lot of the run-of-the-mill stuff can be done by video before correct weight's even declared.
We're just taking it back a step, and like you mentioned earlier about how you use Andre Cassé as your form student, do you also tap into the information that's available by track managers and the new track walker situation that we've got with that's used by both Racing Victoria and we broadcast it here on RSN? Does that sort of information help you to determine how you think a race will unfold?
Oh, absolutely. But in our view, I don't believe as stewards we're there to predict the outcome of a race. But if there's situations where things aren't run to plan, well then the question's asked, and depending on the explanation as to whether that goes any further.
And when you are looking to appoint a new steward, what are the qualities you look for? Would it be in their criteria to maybe have ridden a horse or at least in a race?
Oh, look, obviously that's a great bonus. I believe to have a bit of a balance of the stewards. We've got ex-riders. We've got, but most of the time, obviously, if they've got any clue about racing, they come from a racing background somewhere along the line, whether their father was a bookmaker or their mother or father was a trainer or an ex-jockey. It's been proven in the past that you need to have some sort of background.
All right, so just explain then the process. The jockeys come back to scale after a particular race. What do you look for then? Does a jockey tell you automatically that? Do they give you a wink? Do they raise their hand, or do they wait till they get onto the scales before they say, I'm looking at protesting here?
Most riders will wait till they get on the scales to lodge their protest.
And will there be times where you will perhaps say, do you want to look at the film? I mean, from a steward's perspective, if you've seen something which could, determine the outcome of a race, and will you automatically say we're going to put a steward's protest in, or do you speak to the jockey about trying to gain further information?
If we believe there's grounds for an objection and the rider doesn't protest, we will then check it before we give correct weight.
All right. So once a protest hearing actually commences, Terry, how does it unfold? How many people do you allow into a protest hearing from those who are the aggrieved parties, whether it's the one protesting against the winner of the race or the horse that was ahead of them? I mean, how do you like to control what actually happens in a protest hearing?
The normal procedure is that the jockey and trainer of each horse are required at the protest hearing. Owners are welcome to sit in on it, and the managing owner is entitled to put his piece forward if he wishes.
From a steward's perspective, how many people will actually sit on that panel?
Under the rules, we've got to have a minimum of 3, and that'll, depending on what's going on outside, and maybe a 4th steward will deliberate on that, but we certainly always have 3.
Do you have a set amount of time that you allocate to a steward's hearing, or do you just let it unfold as it actually unfolds?
Yeah, we just let it unfold, and obviously the old saying, the longer they go, the better chance you've got, and that's probably true.
Once you've had the presentations put forward, and I'll get Chris to involve himself here in a moment, but once the presentation's actually been put forward by those involved in the hearing, how long, or what's the discussion process like then between the stewards to actually determine the outcome? Can they get heated, or are you all generally on the same page?
Oh, it can be split at times. As the chairman of the meeting, your role is just to speak on behalf of the panel. So I would basically go around the table and ask each steward what they think, and it'll come down to the majority as to which way it goes. And if it's 2-1, well, that's the way it goes. And may not necessarily, as chairman, may not agree with that decision, but that you go with the majority.
Does the chairman get a vote?
Oh, absolutely. And if it's a tie, the chairman gets a casting vote.
Chris, from a jockey's perspective, how difficult is it being involved in a steward's hearing?
Depends if you're giving evidence for yourself or for someone else. Obviously, when the heat's on you, it can get a bit messy in there, and emotions can fly from the rider or sometimes the steward. Sometimes you can grind their gears by focusing on something that they don't agree with, and it can become a little bit of an argument. But and that's where if you do happen to get suspended, well, that's where you've got your right of appeal.
All right, we'll talk about appeals on another day. But, Terry, there was a situation with young Chad Schofield at Caulfield the other week where he was involved in Situation Race 1, and a hearing was conducted virtually straight after, which possibly, and there was a bit of discussion around through the jockeys, that could have had an impact on the way that he rode throughout the rest of the day. He copped a suspension. I mean, is it that important that you have to have hearings immediately between races, or could we look at a shift where perhaps hearings are conducted at the end of the day?
Well, the difficulty, particularly in Victoria, is that they're on again tomorrow. We have 10 or 11 race meetings a week, and people travel near and far to compete at these meetings. So we like to try and we believe there's an emphasis that these matters are dealt with on the day. Otherwise, I wouldn't like to be having things hanging around for 2 months while we're trying to get people together.
All right, plenty of questions are coming through from the audience, Terry, so if we can fire a few at you, and Chris, of course, you can get involved at any stage. This one's from Greg, who's tweeted through. Terry, could you explain how and when will stewards put in gear changes, and what, particularly around elements that could affect jockeys, like if they're wearing spurs for the day? Is that something that's currently notified, if jockeys wear spurs?
No, it's not currently notified, but it's an interesting question because it is on the table. That most countries do not allow spurs these days, and whilst they're fairly unharmful, the ones that we allow, it is on the table as to whether they're allowed going forward. Chris,
well, let's not kid ourselves. Most jockeys can't use them. We ride too short to use them anyway, and a lot of trainers ask you to put them on, but look, in hindsight, they don't make a massive difference.
Flow-on question from that then, Terry, would be, when do you actually draw a line in the sand that a gear change can't be notified? When do they have to be put forward?
Gear changes under the rules are supposed to be declared by acceptance time for the race meeting.
This one's from Trevor. When are questions regarding jockey tactics actually raised? So from a steward's perspective, if you're not sure, and you mentioned earlier that you have your discussion with your form analyst, but when do you actually, if something hasn't sort of worked out the way you guys think it should have, when do you start asking those questions?
Well, that generally unfolds during the course of the race meeting. Obviously, if there's something that comes to light after the race meeting, there's nothing to stop the stewards from inquiring into that at a later time, but most of these things get dealt with on the day.
One from Ben, which probably could affect both of you here. In regards to protest hearing, do you feel that there is a place for owners to be involved in the stewards' room during a protest hearing? I'll ask you first, Terry.
Look, I might be old-fashioned, but Shane, as far as I'm concerned, they're putting their hard money down and paying for these horses and expensive horses to be trained, and I think they're at least entitled to hear their fate.
Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think they're entitled to be in there. Quite often they don't have much to say anyway. They'll just agree with the trainer or the jockey in their evidence, but they're paying the bills. I think they obviously should be allowed to be in there.